Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It was a fun episode we made the other day, talking about various pressings and the social constructs of music. And it's important to remember that social consciousness in music hasn't always been a part of Western culture. I'm sure many hymns discuss our social ramifications, and obviously some of the classical pieces does deal with some of the war and history of stuff, but it's different than the Psalms of the Old Testament talking about struggle, and it's different than the black music of the last century speaking about we need to overcome in spite of all these odds. It's a very different experience. And it's interesting how we look at Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan as these kind of originators of social consciousness, which in a lot of ways they are, especially for the white influence community. But for the black community, Dylan wasn't necessarily speaking about them or for them. And they had been speaking their own message already for a long time, going back to the cotton fields. And blues, gospel, in the black tradition of gospel, jazz music, it's always had a strong undercurrent of survival and overcoming. And of course, I showed last episode how that transitioned so nicely right into the soul music of that era, into the hip-hop of the 80s and the 90s, into the 2000s. And sadly, the music of that lineage has assimilated into the main trunk of pop music. And Nicki Minaj and Kanye West have zero consciousness to them, zero spirituality to them. Their marketing products it's garbage. It's really sad to see the main thrust, the trunk of black music, have become so assimilated and so subverted. And I've often shared that the record industry was being fueled by the edgy music of the black community, and they felt the need to sticker that stuff in the 80s. Parental Music Resource Center, PMRC, parental warnings, and talking about the streets and their life's experience wasn't something they wanted white America really exposed to. And it only made the music more popular, and more kids wanted to have. No kid wanted to have the record that was censored. Every kid wanted to have the one that had the F-bombs, the N-words, and the truth unwatered down. And it feels real strongly to me, just like how disco was subverted to separate the races once again in 1980. And it's a stark line. You know, white people go from knowing black music, Barry White, and all the disco hits of the late 70s, Cheryl Lynn and the Emotions. All those songs were very ubiquitous and crossed racial lines very effortlessly. And it went the same for a lot of the white disco records. Black folks know the Bee Gees. You know, so there was an assimilation of race and sexuality that made certain aspects of our culture very uncomfortable. And it was driven apart in the 80s. And as the popularity of hip-hop grew, and the edginess of that music grew, and the honesty of that lyric became more evident and more powerful, and NWA comes on the scene, and Ice-T starts talking about cop killer, and all that really charged militant resistance music started to be spoken vocally, it really leads to a concerted effort to try to control and restrict. And the FBI had files on a lot of these musicians, and going back to Bob Marley and John Lennon, these guys were always being monitored. We got to be careful what our kids are hearing and listening to. You let them go too hippie on us, and we're going to have ourselves a civil strife. We're going to have ourselves a revolution. And that's only their concern economically. They will allow all kinds of civil strife as long as there's profiting to be done from it. But once it starts becoming an issue and blocking their economic agendas, and they're blocking train tracks and oil pipelines and meddling with our international policies. Suddenly these introspective young youth with opinions become a hindrance, and they had to be subverted. The Black Panthers had to be subverted. And you see it across the board throughout history. Never in history has a people known the truth of what their empirical leaders were doing. And we're not being governed by politics. The government is a reactionary body. The economic leaders, as always, are making the true calling and governing the ship and deciding where it goes. So there had to be a subversion of black music at some point. Because too many white kids were diving into it. Pac and Biggie and Dre and Snoop. It was becoming omnipresent. And the stickering wasn't working. It was just actually adding fuel to the fire. And then the next generation, like Mos Def and Talib Kweli and Common, comes along. And that further intellectually inspires black and white community and brings us together. And there was a positive thing happening. And what you see is that was taken out of the clubs and off the radio. They completely take the conscious side of the music out of the charts and away from the masses. And then what happens next is, as the prisons become private enterprise, there's a certain amount of portfolio building by the elite. And if I owned a prison, it's not a bad idea to buy myself a small record label, hire the 5 dumbest kids I could find, and put them out there to rap about diamonds and Ferraris and expensive wristwatches and shoes, and create this consciousness that I am not going to get laid if I don't get those things. And I'll never achieve those things in and of myself in this fleshly existence. I must resort to a life of crime to achieve those things and glorify the violence, glorify the criminality, which Ice-T and Ice Cube and all the early MCs were never glorified in the streets. It was a disaster. They were trying to escape. Even Eazy-E, as gangster as he was, and he was a real life gangster and a garbage rapper, but he wasn't celebrating it. He was saying, this is my only choice. And now we got cats like the Migos celebrating and making it sound like the trap house is the place to be, and my Raris and my Ice is it makes me happy. And they don't own those cars, they don't own those wristwatches, they don't own those diamonds. It's all being leased to them for videos to instill in a young generation the need to have those things to be cool and hip, and to eventually fill the prisons that are being built to house them. It's one of the most diabolical things I've ever imagined. And if I owned a prison, I would want to fill it. I can't think of a better way than having a young record label, hiring some dumb kids to rap on it, talking about some dumb shit. And next thing you know, they're all arrestable. And the freedom of civil rights no longer exists. They use the drug war in the same way to subvert people. It's a mess. It's a mess. But Bob Dylan wasn't the beginning of conscious music. It was the beginning of conscious music in our Western idiom. The black community had always had this duality of spirituality, social consciousness, and sexuality. So it's not even a duality, it's a triality. And their music's always laced with those entities. You know, I'm going to overcome, I'm going to find me some nut, and I'm going to praise my creator, because I'm still here. I still ticking, you ain't broke me yet. And into all that is the jazz music that we're speaking of in the 50s and 60s that is so tangibly expressing a lot of these things. I want to dive in now into part 1 of my series on Riverside. Riverside, for my money, in 1960, 61, 62, is the second greatest label out there. And Impulse is kind of finding its way. We like what Impulse does, and a lot of it's great sounding, beautifully packaged, but it's not a clear mission statement at Impulse. It's just who's available, we're going to sign them and put it out there, and it's across the spectrum, from pop jazz to swing jazz, from the edges of the beginnings of the avant-garde, Coltrane, to George Wein. You know, there's just a wide. They're doing collegiate school jazz concerts at times. So there's an incredible spectrum at Impulse that's not equal. It's very spread across many palettes. But Riverside is doing this concise, modern post-bop sound that dovetails nicely with what Blue Note's doing. And there's a lot of crossover between musicians on these labels. A lot of guys who were leaders on one were sidemen on the other label. There was a lot of working together. By this time, Prestige is starting to go more and more towards soul jazz, organ jazz, more boogie at the chicken shack Prestige jazz. A lot of it's 45 worthy, and there's longer versions on the albums. But Jack McDuff doesn't stir the same feelings that some of the records on Riverside and most of the records on Blue Note and Riverside do. Prestige still has the new jazz thing going on, which we'll get into in the next section on this video. But this is going to be a two-part thing on Riverside. Riverside has an incredible body of work in 1961. There's probably close to 60 albums, which I'm going to try to show you. I'm not going to be able to play tidbits from all of them because it's just going to be too difficult to do. By the way, the Jazz Shepherd merchandise, it's available. Go to the Teespring site, which you'll see listed below on the video. Buy the merch. It's great stuff, beautiful designs. You'll see how the sheep turns into an LP, which is a wonderful design by my friend Sven van Hooydonk from Belgium. I'm proud to say I have friends all over the world via this channel, and I want to thank all of you guys for your support. It's been a wonderful experience, and a lot of growing has been happening with me and myself. And I spent a couple years driving Uber and Lyft between DJ gigs, and I was kind of honing my dialogue, and I was always fairly good at communicating, but in Lyft I would just hone a lot of my ideations and a lot of my philosophies, and I would have so many comments that were just like, that was the best car I'd ever had. Just talking philosophy and spiritual, social conscious elements. And you get a lot of international travelers driving to the airports and stuff. And I was just really realizing how different the state of mind is internationally than it is domestically. And there's an American consciousness that's so shaped by nationality that's very different from the global mindset. And that's been super validated here on this channel. There's a lot of people in Europe and Asia and other places that are right in lockstep with what I have to say, and half the American populace thinks I'm insane. But it doesn't jive with what their upbringing has taught them. And part of what their upbringing has taught them is to not be taught, to not learn. Just be distracted and go about your business. But anyway, let's dive in. Riverside, like I said, in 1961, starts with Bill Evans. This is Explorations, and this is outstanding stuff. We've been playing in the background here. Paul Motion and Scott LaFaro. Scott LaFaro is going to pass, I believe, end of the year. I think he's going to pass away from us. One of the great young bass players in this music. Very expressive, dynamic player. And truly, in a lot of these Riverside Bill Evans records, he's as much a lead player on these records as Evans. He's a very expressive, dynamic player that has a lot to offer and a lot to say. Evans is the tinkling of a beautiful, clear brook. He's a very cerebral player. He's not super bluesy, but he comes from a very sad upbringing. I did an episode on him, a biography, and he comes from an alcoholic tradition, an abusive parent. He was raised a lot by his aunt. It's some sad stuff. And so he's got plenty of sorrow of his own that allows him to emote with the black musicians. He's right in lockstep with the connection between emoting and improvising and expressing from my condition through my music and my art. And that's what great art always does. So Evans is absolutely one of the true geniuses. He latched on to what George Russell was teaching him when he worked with Russell at Decca earlier in the 50s. And Russell's delving into a lot of the different scales, and he's also delving into the modal ideology and tapping into some of the edges of the avant-garde with his compositions. Russell was a very progressive arranger and producer, and his bands were always well tooled with musicians who could hone in on his ideologies, and they're very interesting records. If you're a Mingus guy, if you're a Monk guy, George Russell's stuff on RCA, on Decca, and then on Riverside, it's very complex, interesting stuff. And I think a lot of you would really appreciate it if you don't know what George Russell was about. Moving along, Teri Thornton is number 352. A great singer, a bluesy voice. This is also the same record. So don't be fooled thinking you're getting a second Teri Thornton. I was fooled. It's a separate series number. So I thought, oh, this must be a different record by hers until I got it. They're the same damn songs. Interesting. It fills up my knowledge, but don't always need to have two records by the same artist. It's interesting how on the Dylan record I posted, some of my friends had 5 and 6 copies of some of those Dylan records. And there she is. I had to give you a little taste of her. Nice bluesy timbre. She's got a lot of soul and conviction. Yeah, Lullaby of the Leaves, baby. I'm a big fan of that record. It's definitely something worth seeking out. It'll just sit in you and chew at you. It'll chew away at you. You know, she's got this vibrato, but it's not like Sarah Vaughan's. It's deeper and not as tight a vibrato. Hers is very small intervals. Hers is looser. And she's got this great way of kind of bending notes and finding her way through the melody. A true jazz singer in a lot of ways. She's playing like a horn in a lot of senses. Great stuff. Going to Kansas City, Buck Clayton. This is Dickie Wells, Charlie Bird, which is kind of weird. Charlie Bird's on here, but Bird hasn't joined RCA. Hasn't joined Riverside yet. A lot of the great swing cats are on this. It's pretty much a throwback session to the swing era. Great stuff. Number 354 is the great Barrett Harris, Detroit raised, piano impresario, a very wonderful player, very distinct style. He ends up becoming one of the great teachers of jazz in New York for a long time. He's teaching the next generations of this music, and I believe, from what I remember, he does so into the 2000s. Harris stayed with us for a long time. I think he's passed by now, but his Riverside stuff to me, he's not as blues driven as some guys, but he's got some of the Monk and Powell. He's got some of the blues and swing, but he's also kind of an intellectual, cerebral player. I think if you put Bud Powell and Billy Taylor, he's somewhere between that. I love Barry Harris's records. He seems to be a guy that might not be easy to get along with. He seems like one of those cats that's a little bit in his own head, edgy. But a lot of those guys, like Monk, Mingus, they're trying to emote ideas. And sometimes the last thing you want when you're trying to express or fulfill or complete a thought is to have someone distract you and make you forget your train of thought. And some of those guys, I think, respond to that poorly. And I think Harris probably fits into that a little bit. Cannonball Adderley has a great group going here. This, again, number 355. And Cannonball's in a great place in 61. He's pretty much done with Miles Davis at this point. Miles is reshuffling his entire band. He starts his own group at Riverside. He's had a couple groups already, working groups. He's worked with Yusuf Lateef coming up a little bit here. But this record has Wes Montgomery, the great British Victor Feldman, there's the great Ray Brown on bass, the young Louis Hayes on the drums, and of course Adderley. It's just a fantastic, light, fun, vivacious swinging session. It's called the Pole Winners, and that's because most of these players, if not all, had been doing well, if not winning, the fan polls where you vote who's the great players of each year, kind of thing. 355, 356, 357 is a double LP, and it's the beginning of this New Orleans, Chicago throwback to the Dixieland era. And Riverside, Orrin Keepnews, and Bill Grauer had a real love affair with the Dixieland sound. They recorded a lot of it in the early 50s when they first launched the label on the 10-inch stuff, and they didn't reissue a lot of that on the LP. And they had this great idea in about 1960 to start tracking down a lot of the great, unknown to people, New Orleans and Chicago traditionalists. And there's about 24 or 25 of these in total. And it's the one part of the Riverside discography I have not completed. I have probably 14 of the 24. And there's a few coming up in this stretch I'm going to be missing. They all have a similar cover layout. Most of them aren't double issues. In fact, this one was probably initially single LPs because it has both LP numbers there. But it's very much New Orleans tradition stuff. It's got a lot of names that aren't going to be very familiar to people. Some names we'll know, like Earl Hines and Percy Humphrey's a fairly big name. Louis Cottrell, Kid Thomas, Sweet Emma and her Dixieland Boys, Peter Bocage and his Creole Serenaders, Jim Robinson's New Orleans Band, Lil Armstrong has a record on this. There's a lot of interesting vintage players that they were trying to record before they passed. And these records are interesting, they're fun. I'm going to skip over them kind of as we come to them because they're not really part of the modern series, and I do wish they'd given those 24 records their own sequence. It's, to me, they would have fit better in their own separate numerical sequence. But as it is, they're part of this sequence, and certainly Keepnews and Grauer know more about this than I do, how to run jazz label. This is the great Sam Jones, one of the great bass players of this era. He's a real stalwart at Riverside, and he's on endless Riverside sessions. And he shows up on other labels from time to time, but for the most part, he's a Riverside guy, Sam Jones. And if you look at Riverside's discography and Sam Jones' recordings, he's on a lion's share of a lot of records at Riverside in the early to mid-60s. Great bass player, great tonal center, dynamic player. He has 3 records as a leader on Riverside. This one's called The Chant. With Blue Mitchell, Nat Adderley, Cannonball, Jimmy Heath, Wynton Kelly, Victor Feldman, and Lewis Hayes. Sounds like Nat. Nat's always got that bright, yo, that's me. Yo, but when Nat introduces himself, and trumpets do this more than anybody else. Trumpets were going to give you a little fanfare to say, hey, this is my turn, my space, allow me to do my thing. Nat had a very bright tone that always kind of demanded attention. Cannonball, of course, is kind of a more chilled out version of the Adderley sound. Blue Mitchell's fantastic on this as well. Heath Kelly, it's just a great record. And Sam Jones records are pretty tough to come by. The Blues Holiday, Paul Serrano Quintet. Paul Serrano played with the MJT out of Chicago. He played with Walter Perkins for a number of years. This is his one record as a leader. He's a fiery trumpet player. Jody Christian's on this, Don Garrett, Pete LaRocca, and Bunky Green, another great Argo sax player who really swings the blues hard. I'm a big fan of Bunky Johnson, great player. Tough record to come by, number 359. Number 360 is Dave Pike, one of the great vibraphonists of this era. He's a very modern player. He likes to delve into interesting composition. He's unafraid of tackling any kind of material. He'll do stickier stuff. He'll approach the avant-garde. He'll play some straight up hard driving bebop improvisation. He's a pretty varied player, and it's a pretty impressive talent that he's got to play the vibraphone in almost any setting. One of Dave Pike's finest records is this number 360 on Riverside. This is with the great Barry Harris, who we just talked about, Billy Higgins, and Reggie Workman. Kind of a tougher record to come by, and it tends to be climbing up in price. This is the Hooter, number 361, the Jazz 5. And these 5 cats are from England. Malcolm Cecil, Billy Iden, Tony Mann on the drums, Harry Klein, Brian Doe, and Vic Ash. This is recorded in London in late 1960. Comes out in 61. It's great stuff. Great English players that Riverside gives some exposure to here. And as we'll see in the Jazzland sequence in part 2, where I'm going to show you about 15, 16 of the Jazzland stuff they put out in the same year, they also give more room to a few more British players in the Jazzland sequence. So you can definitely tell Keaton Hughes and Bill Grauer had their ears to the ground. They were listening for what was going on. This is Grooveyard. It's Wes Montgomery's brothers. And I think actually Wes is on this one. Indeed he is. With Buddy and Monk Montgomery. Bobby Thomas is on the drums. Recorded in New York in 61. It's fun hearing Wes play with his brothers Buddy and Monk. And Buddy and Monk were part of the Master Sounds. And you'll see Master Sounds records on World Pacific, on Fantasy, and you might go, I don't know what this is, I should pass it up. And it's Wes Montgomery's brothers. And Wes is on a lot of those records as a guest. He'll show up and play on a track or two, sometimes on the whole record. I highly recommend those Master Sounds records if you like smooth, sailing, but grooving West Coast cool. You know, they're brothers, so they ain't going to be playing it not grooving. They're going to groove it out for you. There's a reason why it's called Grooveyard. But those Master Sound records are worth, and you can find them for under $10. You want a great deal for under $10? Look for a Master Sounds record on Pacific. It's fun stuff. And they tackle any music possible, and they put that swing to it. Bobby Timmons, one of my favorite players. He's a great pianist. He comes up in the Jazz Messengers. He's a great heir apparent to Horace Silver in the Jazz Messengers. And he doesn't directly replace Horace Silver. There's a few pianists in there in between. But Timmons really fit the Jazz Messenger chair really well. And he was also a great composer, Bobby Timmons. That Dare and Work Song and other tracks. He recomposes some real standards that the Messengers played and are still part of the jazz lexicon today. This is with Sam Jones and Jimmy Cobb. So it's a stripped down trio. Pretty skinny little fella. Number 363. It's interesting often hearing him do stuff that he does with the Messengers in his own solo setting. Because it'll often take some of that flair and edge and the grandeur and fury of what's Shorter and Morgan and Curtis Fuller and Blakey and the thunder of the Messengers. Now he'll take his composition and do it in a trio setting and give it a whole different lighting. And we all know how you light a room can change its atmosphere. And with the Blakey group, it's floodlights. It's just a whole ton of illumination on the entire piece. And with Timmons, it's more mood lighting. It's more soft and gentle, and it's going to be more flattering to some of us. You know, bright light isn't good for everybody's appearances, I'll tell you that. Great record. I love Bobby Timmons stuff on Riverside. Anything you find Bobby Timmons on Riverside is worth having. Here's another one of those New Orleans. This is Sweet Emma, the Bell Gallon, or Dixieland Boys featuring Jim Robinson. And then I think this next one is also Kid Thomas and his Algiers Stompers, New Orleans Living Legends. And like I said, New Orleans and Chicago is mostly where they're looking for these people. Chicago maintained a great Dixieland scene for a long time, which didn't really exist in New York the same way from what I've understood. But Chicago seemed to have a lot of throwback Dixieland bars where the sound really stayed in the New Orleans tradition. Armstrong's legacy there. It just seemed to be more rooted still in the South. By the time you got to New York, it was modern, it was bebop, it was avant-garde. New York was very cutting edge. Chicago was still rooted in the blues and still allowed the Dixieland sound to survive. And of course, New Orleans itself, you never really escaped the Dixieland sound in Dixie. If you're in New Orleans to this day, you can walk into a bar at 3 in the morning and hear a trombone plunging away and a clarinet doing things that they never taught us about in school that clarinets could do. The great Victor Feldman, one of the great UK players to come across again. He's a great pianist. He plays with Miles Davis briefly around this time, actually. Miles wanted him in his group, and he refused to join Miles. I think a lot of people worked with Miles purely because of the size of the paychecks. And there's some cats who are just like, you know what? You can't pay me enough to be in this environment. It was toxic and a difficult chair to be in. This is a great Blue Mitchell record with strings. And he has a couple records on Riverside where he's playing with strings. And he's a beautiful, sensitive, lyrical player. And so he actually fits in with the strings quite wonderfully. Tad Dameron is doing the arrangements here, and Benny Golson does a few of them as well. It's a big group. Clark Terry, Bert Collins, Britt Woodman, Julian Priester, Tommy Flanagan, Charlie Persett, Jimmy Cleveland, Irby Green, Philly Joe. It's a big ensemble. And this is the type of record, guys have been doing jazz with strings before even Charlie Parker was doing it. You know, it's not that uncommon to have a label say, let's put you with the European tradition of the string section. And I think without question, most records with strings were designed to find a white audience. And even the cover, Smooth as the Wind, Blue Mitchell with strings and brass. You could be a classical fan and not know what this is in a record store and go, oh, Blue Mitchell, that sounds nice. Who's Blue Mitchell? I think I shall have this and drink it with my tea later this evening with a crumpet. Blue Mitchell with strings, I love it, darling. Look at the sunset, it's marvelous. And it is that kind of melancholy, laid back, escape. There's no reflection of racial tension here. There's barely even an inflection of the black experience, which these records, I think, on some levels are designed to move past that and to be commercially viable. Johnny Griffin is firmly entrenched at Riverside at this point. He has that great introduction at Blue Note where he makes himself quite a name. And he was already kind of a legend in Chicago where his first album on Argo comes out. But love when they pluck the strings like that. But by the time Griffin goes to Riverside, he's become one of the leading saxophone players of his time. From what I understand, guys like Rollins and Coltrane had a great deal of love and respect for Johnny Griffin. He was a furious player that could play at any tempo. He plays the blues always. He's one of the most dexterous, fluid players of the saxophone. This has got Julius Watkins on the French horn, which is what we were hearing there a second ago. Bill Lee on the bass. Larry Gale also plays bass. And then Ben Riley's on the drums. And that's why it's called Change of Pace, because obviously the French horn is bringing some colors to it that's going to be slightly different. But again, part of what jazz was doing at this point was looking for other tonalities to add to the mix. And modern jazz was really taking a lot of the feathers off. And there's so much great, interesting, new-sounding jazz, and it doesn't have to be labeled free or avant-garde to be complex, interesting, and worthy of note. A record like this is just enough edge and new direction that most people would love it if they knew about it. But no one's out there going, oh, you should have Johnny Griffin Change of Pace with Julius Watkins on the French horn. Everyone's talking about Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane. This is fantastic stuff. Griffin's a great player. he's so broad in his ability that he can do these great blowing records with Lockjaw Davis, and then the next week he can show up and do a record with a French horn player and be completely different. He was a small guy, they called him the Little Giant, and I think there's really not a bad Griffin record on Blue Note or on Riverside. They're all worthy of being owned. Two more of the New Orleans Revival session here, Jim Robinson and Billy and Dee Dee Pierce. And I haven't been as diligent as picking these up. I have all of them so far. There's a few going to be missing coming up in part 2, but I'll grab them eventually. On top of it, their album covers are kind of boring. Once you have 14 of them, the covers are kind of monotonous. This is Hey Baby, the Jazz Brothers, featuring Gap and Chuck Mangione. And what's fantastic about this, they're both young players. He's got the bent bell like Disney. This is a long ways away from the fusion pop R&B jazz these guys played in the 70s and 80s, where they sold probably millions of copies of that stuff. And for a lot of people, especially in the black community, stuff like Grover Washington and the Mangione Brothers is what they think of when they think of jazz. You know, if you DJ for a room of 40, 50-year-old black folks, Mangione Brothers is what they think of. Grover Washington, maybe Donald Byrd for the more edgier guys. You know, George Benson. That was the jazz R&B they grew up with. And that's after jazz is so assimilated into R&B and funk that it's really hard to discern the difference between Bill Withers and Grover Washington. And you can put on The Two of Us and play the version without the vibes on it and forget that that's coming from a jazz sensibility. This is a promo copy actually of this. They actually are fantastic players, rooted very much in hard bop. That's Gap and Chuck Mangione. Listen to that tempo, the fury, the velocity. It's not what we think of when we think of Chuck Mangione. And they have a couple records on Riverside. I have 3, I believe. And this is probably the middle one. Number 371. Steve Davis is on the bass, Roy McCurdy's on the drums, and Sal Nistico is on the tenor. And Sal's a fantastic hidden gem. And Sal plays quite a bit with the Mangione boys at this time. And it's really impressive stuff. And I remember shying away from these records at first because I knew the Mangione brother covers. I didn't know the records. I just knew the covers and how cheesy they looked from the 80s and the 70s. I mean, I don't want... But then when I dug into this, I'm like, wow. But that's just it. Most of these cats who play the schmaltzier stuff have roots and chops underneath what they're doing later. You know, they come from the roots of the music. Jimmy Heath, one of the great players on Riverside. He shows up as a sideman a lot. His record as a leader are fantastic. Heath is a diminutive little fella, but he plays with a great ferocity, somewhat like Johnny Griffin. He's probably not as nimble as Griffin, and Griffin's the pinnacle of nimbleness. Like, Johnny Griffin is a dainty, dancing, spry little Shakespearean character, a sprite. Johnny Griffin's a whole other level. But Jimmy Heath is probably a little more anchored in the blues all the time. A little less rooted in exploring and more staying straight-centered, Jimmy Heath. He's definitely got a strong bebop roots behind him. And he comes up in Philadelphia. Coltrane plays in his band early on. He's part of the big Philadelphia scene. Of course, his brothers, Tootie Heath and Al. It's Al Tootie Heath. Who's his other brother? Percy Heath, bass player and a drummer. They're both his bigger brothers. Were big parts of the jazz scene for a long time. And Jimmy's just passed, I believe, recently. I get him and Golson. Golson's still with us, and I think Heath passed. I think we just lost him. But great record. And lo and behold, look who shows up on this. Freddie Hubbard. Julius Watkins on the French horn, Cedar Walton's on the piano, Percy Heath, and Albert Heath. So it's a family affair there. It's odd how sometimes the brothers don't play together as much as you think they would. And that's the same for the Jones brothers. You think the Jones brothers would play together more often than they do, but of course you get into working groups, and so your obligations can often take you elsewhere. But this is number 372. A great place to start with Jimmy Heath. You know, you've got Julius Watkins adding that French horn color. And by the way, Julius Watkins stuff on the Dawn label with the jazz modes is fantastic. But there's Hubbard giving it that bright, brilliant dexterity of his sound, coupled with the blues of Heath. This is the quota. I can't listen to Hubbard and not be like, eventually, Hubbard's always going to make me wince and joy. This is Eddie Lockjaw Davis. This is Afrojaws. And it's called that because it's got some of the Afro-Cuban thing going on. They add some percussion to it, some Latin beats. And Lockjaw Davis is a guy that never had a lot of formal training. He wasn't a guy that tried to reinvent the wheel. His rhythms, his tonality, his blues sensibility always kept him very much centered, and he wanted to blow. He wanted to tell stories. He doesn't have formal training. He's not trying to write great compositions and reinvent jazz. He wants to always set you on his knee in the Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, Lester Young sensibility and tell you a swinging tale. And he plays a lot with the aforementioned Johnny Griffin. They do some great blowing records, both at Riverside, Jazzland, and at Prestige. But Griffin here this is a little bit of a left turn for him, playing in a Latin setting, and it's actually fantastic. It's a very interesting cover, Afrojaws. I think Ray Barretto's on this, if I recall. Clark Terry, Ernie Royal, John Bello, Lloyd Mayers, Ray Barretto, Ben Riley. Recorded in New York in 1961, May 4th and 12th. I've always liked this record. I like the cover. It's a little bit weird, but somehow it fits. And of course, I think 1961, the Brazilian thing's about to really take off. Disney's already popularized the Afro-Cuban thing a decade earlier, but it's really starting to become something that most artists want to dabble in here and there. And that's a great little foray by our young Mr. Lockjaw Davis. This is the great Ida Cox, and she's a blues singer in the strictest sense of the word. Blues singer. This probably almost could have fit in the traditional series that they were doing, but because it's got Coleman Hawkins on it, I think they wanted to give it this more modern cover. I think there's another version of this album out there somewhere on some other label, and Grauer ends up purchasing it and issuing it. I'm not positive, but I do think there's another Ida Cox Coleman Hawkins record out there in my blues section, and I'm guessing it's probably this same session. I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me. But this takes you right back to the cotton fields. You know what I mean? If you can't picture a wooden shack and just the poverty, the desperation, it's all very linked to that. Sadly, I can't help but see Dave Chappelle right now being the Clayton Bigsby, the white supremacist that's a black guy. One of the greatest sketches ever. Roy Eldridge is on the trumpet, little jazz, and he's playing that muted fury in the background. Hawkins is on the tenor, Sammy Price. Milt Hinton is on the bass, along with Joe Jones, and that's Papa Joe Jones, recorded in New York in April of '61. Now you can see Bean right there. It looks like probably Milt's behind him. Could be Roy Eldridge, I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. I think it's Milt. Eldridge is great. That's the blues. And that's what I'm talking about, blues and jazz. They're so interchangeable that you can just plug a singer in and she'll take the place of the horn. And the horn players can just color in around her and behind her. You take the vocalist away, doesn't mean it's not the blues anymore. It's jazz blues, you know. One of the great records of this stretch is Aesthetics by the great aforementioned George Russell. We talked about him during the Bill Evans moment. One of the most serious players and composers, and this shows you kind of right there the edges of jazz in '61. From the blues of Ida Cox, Coleman Hawkins, and Roy Eldridge to this fantastic George Russell record. And who's playing the trombone there? Dave Baker. That was impressive. I'm not super well versed in who Dave Baker even is. But Dolphy's on this. And Dolphy, of course, was instrumental in a lot of changes in jazz in 59, 60, 61. He's influencing Mingus. He's shaping Chico Hamilton's grooves. He's reshaping John Coltrane's sound and his concepts of the music. Here he is with George Russell. Stephen Swallows on the bass, Joe Hunt on the drums, and George Russell on the piano. Don Ellis is on the trumpet, by the way. Great record. The compositions are outstanding. George wrote Aesthetic, which is what this is. He also wrote the track Thoughts, and Lydia also on this side. They do the Miles Davis track Nardius, and then Monks Round Midnight on the second side. This is some fantastic, edgier than Impulse in '61. Modern cutting edges of the music. This whole series starts out as being, where is the music in each year? Who's leading the charge? And we see in different years some labels being more prominent and other labels hardly existing. You know, by '61, a lot of those great labels in the '50s are gone. And Riverside's become one of the most important houses of jazz. Impulse ain't there yet. Verve's in a great transition right now. And Verve's not going to lead the charge anymore from this point forward in the cutting edge of jazz. The closest they're going to get to cutting edge is being one of the great innovators of the bossa nova. But we're not going to really consider that cutting edges of jazz, the bossa nova. It was a huge impact on jazz and was one of jazz's last shining moments commercially, but we're not going to say that was cutting edge. Riverside in '61, along with Blue Note, is doing the most progressive, innovative, brilliant, challenging, up-tempo, down-tempo, straight blues, Dixieland. Riverside's covering it. Riverside's bringing all the elements. And one of the things about George Russell is he's kind of constantly presented as that could be a white guy. But if you Google him on Google Image, you'll see photos of him and you see how black he really is. So they truly, even at Riverside, it seems like they find as white a pictures of the guy as they can. And that was even more so the case back at RCA and Decca. Number 376 is the second Bill Evans record in the stretch by the Village Vanguard. I probably don't even need to play this. This is so well known. There's Dolphy. Everybody knows Live Evans at this point. LaFar When Motion is still on this from June of 1961. It's beautiful stuff. I don't gotta tell anybody to buy that record. This is Cannonball Adderley's next record at Riverside, number 377, and he has a lot of records at Riverside. Starting about 260 in there somewhere, all the way through into the 400s. Cannonball Adderley has a lot of titles, and he's truly one of the stalwarts of Riverside. He's what Coltrane was to Impulse, what Mobley is to Blue Note. Cannonball Adderley is to Riverside. He's a real important and constant at the label. He actually has a minor hit with African Waltz here And by minor, it was actually a pretty big hit. It's a track that people will recognize. I've played it at the club before. I almost hate to turn off the Dolphy. It's a short little number, but it was a very popular piece. It's a strange little bit. But I think this was... Yeah, it's a big group. Matt, Bob Brookmeyer, Ernie Royal, Melba Liston, Jimmy Cleveland, Cannonball, Oliver Nelson, Jerome Richardson, Don Butterfield, Sam Jones, Charlie Purcell, Quentin Kelly. My God, it's a big group. So it's pretty much in an orchestral setting. And they're playing some pretty big band type of compositions here. Curtis Edwards bought that in 1966. That was interesting. There's a little bit more blues and swing in that. It's a very fun record. And it shows you again the diversity of what Riverside was giving us. It's probably broader in its scope than what was happening at Blue Note. Blue Note was fairly narrow in its scope in 61. Riverside's definitely opening more doorways and challenging more sounds. This is Percy Home for Number 378, and it looks like that's the last one I'm going to cover here in part one. Again, one of the New Orleans kind of traditionalist sounds. So that wraps up part one on Riverside. It's an incredible run by an incredible label, and arguably as important a label in 61 as Blue Note is. Riverside's past prestige impulse hasn't really arrived quite on the scene to take over yet. And a lot of the other great labels like Savoy, Bethlehem are pretty much shadows of their former selves. Argo's starting to do kind of that soul jazz thing. Emercy's no more. So the jazz scene's changed dramatically by 61. And yet in New York, Blue Note and Riverside are really just kind of being the steam engines that plow along and incorporate the gradual changes and shifts in the sound and stay at the leading and the cutting edge. And Blue Note definitely is that hammer, 56, 57, 58. And then Riverside kind of joins them, 58, 59, 60, 61. Blue Note and Riverside are the great labels of this time. Prestige has taken a step back, without question. There's still a lot of great things happening at Prestige, but Bob Weinstock isn't Alfred Lyon. Bob Weinstock's not Orton Keepnews or Bill Grauer. You don't get the sense from Weinstock that he loves jazz more than he loves money. And you 100% get the feeling from Keepnews and Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf and Bill Grauer that they love jazz. And just the sheer body of work that Riverside puts out in 61, that's half of it. The other half's coming in part two. And to put that much material out, you're not really having the time to promote it. After Grauer dies tragically in 63, it's revealed how mismanaged the money side of things was, and the label ends up in bankruptcy shortly after. And they're putting out volumes of material. They're not turning a buck. There's a lot of problems with the financial side at Riverside. Blue Note had money issues as well, but not like Riverside's. I love the Riverside legacy. It needs to be held in higher esteem than it is. If we take anything away from this chronology series, looking at it year by year, we should see how important Riverside is. 58 through 63, they are right there on the heels of Blue Note and leading the charge with Blue Note year after year after year with a lot of the same musicians. And yet those Riverside titles will sell for a third of what the Blue Notes sell, based surely off of the marketing of today's consumers. And that's an injustice. This Riverside is absolutely fantastic and deserves and is worthy of every bit of praise. And the good news is it means that collectors can go out there and grab Riversides for a great price. You can still get old Riversides for a good price. Because of the bankruptcy, they were sold and taken over by Fantasy eventually, and so they are part of the OJC series. And OJC unfortunately doesn't issue all of the Riverside titles, but they do issue a lot of them. So you can access a lot of great Riverside via the OJC label and get the stuff for a great price. OJC stuff always sounds fantastic. And like I said, I'm not really going to talk about pressings very often, but the most important pressing issue is how can I find it affordably? That's really what you need to talk about. And for most people, $30-$40 is what they want to spend at most on a jazz record. I don't think everybody wants to spend $75 on a record, $150, $200, $500, nor should they have to. There's a lot of great jazz, and I'm going to repeat that. There's a ton of great jazz available for $15 to $40. And most of the Riverside catalog, you can find it in some version in that price range. One of the exceptions, of course, would be Bill Evans. Bill Evans stuff, has gotten very expensive, but that's where these reissues come in handy. That's where it's nice to know about some of the European labels that are putting the stuff out there. Try to get the original covers, because if you don't get the original covers, it's easier to get confused. Like, oh shit, do I have this? Do I not have this? I don't know. So try to always get original artwork if you can, because that way you don't buy the same record later when you find the original cover. So that's part one, Riverside. Part two will be coming in a day or two. Gotta be safe, peace.